Coffee was clearly exciting. Good morning and welcome back. In this session, I want to build on what we talked about in the last session. So we had a really good conversation for the last hour and a half about the developing geopolitics of the region, the economic, the broader security and political dimensions and drivers that are really changing the continent rapidly. What I want to focus on this panel is the implications for military forces of the region and the security forces of the region. What does all of this mean for them, and what does it mean in terms of modernization and reform that might need to take place in the coming years and decades? So I'm Peter Olive. I'm a fellow here at RUSI. I am very much a former Royal Navy officer. I know it says Commodore on there, but it's retired. So I'm not representing the British government. But in my last role in defence, I led the UK's Global Strategic Trends Programme, which had a deep dive into this region. And great to see some of my old team here come to see me mess it up. And I'm glad to be joined, and honoured to be joined actually, by a very distinguished panel. So we have Estefania Dominguez, who is from Janes and is the Americas Senior Analyst. Welcome. Sarah Martinez, who is at the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence and leads on the Western Hemisphere. Marcelo Masalleras, who is also a retired Army officer and is now a senior researcher at the AthenaLab in Chile. And Juan Battaleme, Secretary of International Defense Affairs at the Ministry of Defense in Argentina. So welcome to you all. So let's draw on some of that broader context to try and distill some implications for tasks, the things that defence and security forces have to do. And I want to first start that dialogue around serious and organised crime. So Estefania, I know Janes have recently done some research on how the cartels have not just expanded their reach geographically, but in terms of the number of areas of criminal and non-criminal activity that they now have their fingers into. Would you like to give us a sense of that and what that might mean in terms of the tasks facing defence and security, the defence and security forces of the region?
I think that doing a conference in January is a really good excuse to look at the main events that took place during 2024. And serious and organised crime, particularly drug trafficking, is one of the main shared issues or topics in the Latin American region. So while serious and organized crime is experienced differently across the region, with some countries more affected than others, it's still one of the main shared topics. So serious and organized crime can be looked at from many different perspectives. But the way that we look at it in Janes is from a violence perspective. So particularly we have focused on identifying how these organizations have exercised open and direct violence against civilians, security forces, and even critical national infrastructure. So in 2024, the three main countries that were mostly affected by these violence from these groups, by a higher degree of violence against particularly civilians and security state forces, have been Mexico, Ecuador, and Colombia, with Brazil very close to that, but focusing only on the top three. And the main reason has been serious and organized crime groups competing for controlling territories and routes to facilitate the drug trafficking operations. So in Ecuador, like very briefly, we've seen gangs competing during 2024 for territorial disputes, and as well the routes to the maritime ports, as well as control of the ports, as well as disputing, to say it in a way, like the contracts to do business with Colombian and Mexican drug trafficking organizations, right? then in Colombia, we're seeing, during 2024, we are seeing a changing landscape of groups more focused now on making drug trafficking a primary activity, which is a change from previous, previous ways of looking at these drug trafficking activities. So, for instance, we had FARC before the 2016 peace process. They used to focus a lot more on an ideological, to say it somehow in the spectrum, but it's they had drug trafficking and illicit activities as a secondary activity to feed into to have the funds so they can pursue their main concerns or the main goals. And now we're seeing these changing. Now they're more making illicit activities the primary activity of this. And we also see the Gulf Clan or the Gaitanistas or AGC, now they changed to EGC, their name, expanding their territorial influence during 2024 and taking over control of territories that used to be controlled by FARC. And then finally, we have Mexico. During the first half of 2024, we saw these groups targeting local politicians in the context of the general elections. And basically, they have been targeting the municipal councils because it's a strategic decision, because controlling these local areas facilitates the drug trafficking business. And then we saw an explosion of violence in Culiacán after the arrest of El Mayo Zambada. And basically, we've seen the son of El Mayo Zambada disputing territorial and control with the sons of the former partner, El Chapo. They're called Los Chapitos, right? And we also see, like, this is a specific type of violence that includes intra-cartel violence. So it's Cartel de Sinaloa factions fighting between each other. And these are the countries that have been mostly affected by this, right? By civilians and security forces have been continuously being targeted by this. I think that in terms of what is it that could be driving this thing, the violence, the explosion of violence, and how is it that serious and organized crime groups have been able to continue getting powerful or continue to in their endeavors, is that I think it's the structural violence and poverty, that those are some of the defining factors that we're seeing that help criminal groups recruit all types of people. So often the places that have been most affected by serious and organized crime also tend to be violent, not always, but also show to be very violent. And these are areas where they particularly lack, to say it in a way, like the civilian form of the state, which is how the state makes presence in securing access to the very basic infrastructures, basic services, like schools, healthcare centers, electricity, roads, and connectivity in general. And what we're seeing is that when you lack these type of basic, when you're not covering these basic necessities, what you have is people not being able to seek opportunities. They don't have real opportunities to thrive. And when you see that, you see criminal activities a feasible option for many, because many are just trying to survive. So reduced opportunities to thrive means that serious and organized crime will thrive as well. But there's also a very clear distinction that we need to make in Latin America, which is, yes, there could be a lack of state resources in the civilian realm, which requires a continued or more heavy presence of the state over time, yes, that is lacking in many countries in Latin America. In most countries, some countries more than others, because Latin America is not all the same. But we need to separate that from the defense realm. And I think that most countries, the countries that have been most affected by serious and organized crime, and especially those who have been affected for longer periods of time, enough to change their own military doctrines to include the fight against serious and organized crime, those states are very well equipped to face the threat of serious and organized crime. The challenges might be those countries who are recently changing that to include serious and organized crime, who might face delays in how they face the threat, given the resources, their military capabilities to do that.
Thank you. And I guess on that sort of transition from those who don't have to face it, who had other things to consider, Sarah, would you like to sort of broaden the sort of range of challenges that are facing defense and security organizations, looking from a wider regional perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, thank you, Peter, for organizing this panel. So you did a wonderful job getting us all on the same page, and thank you very much to Carlos and to RUSI for inviting us here. It's been really interesting so far. So one thing I wanted to talk about was really the broader trends in the region that are shaping defense and security strategies and approaches to modernization. And from my perspective, I think there are a number of worrying trends in the region that are going to direct and in some ways limit the options available to governments. So speaking broadly, on the economic front, the region is still recovering from the effects of the COVID pandemic. It had a 7.4% hit to GDP across the region, and the recovery has been slow. The IMF projects average growth in 2024 will be 2.4%. It's estimated that that's what it was, and in 2025 that it will be 2.5%. So this is positive growth, but probably insufficient to meet the many demands on Latin American governments and lower than the global average. Governments have had some success in controlling inflation, which is a key issue for their publics, but they've done this largely by reducing spending, which is a further constraint on growth. So in terms of thinking about where they can make new investments, this is another constraining factor as well. And public debt as a percent of GDP is high. It's about 70% of 70% of public spending. But the region faces higher borrowing costs than others around the globe because of just the higher interest rates they face. So this fiscal picture means that they're going to have to make choices about where they can make investments, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I also wanted to mention, going even broader, the demographic shifts that the region is facing. So they have aging populations, like much of the world right now, due to lower fertility rates and greater life expectancy. And this is increasing pressure on governments to address the fundamental issues they need to take advantage of their demographic dividend, which is when they have more workers per person who is dependent on than dependents. And so the types of things that the governments are being asked to deliver is security. That's a primary issue for voters, but also healthcare, investments in job training, all the things that they need to take advantage during this time to continue to have economic growth. So I only say that to say that the governments are under pressure to deliver on security, but they're under pressure to deliver on a lot of other things as well. Yeah, I know. It's a universal issue right now. And then, as Estefania noted, the region is grappling with a crisis of insecurity, the strength of the gangs we've talked about several times today. And they're driven by weak institutions, in a number of countries, persistent corruption, a lack of economic opportunity. And that need to invest in institutions is another thing that the governments are trying to address, but this is happening again in constrained budgets. and in an environment where publics are looking for quick wins. And that institution building is something that takes truly decades to really make progress. I know that many in here are familiar that Latin America has the highest homicide rates in the world. It's average around 20 per 100,000. But the other thing we're seeing is this sort of surprise way that violence is popping up. And I would say, Ecuador, this had been coming for a while, but still it was shocking to people to see the violence that erupted around the last election. But even places, previously calm places like Costa Rica, other places are experiencing, and in South America, experiencing violence. But there's additional new security challenges that the region faces that don't have to do with organized crime, and I think it's worth paying attention to those as well. Environmental degradation, the impacts of climate change that are changing how governments or how militaries need to think about the investments that they're making in new vehicles, things like that. Cybercrime, especially as the region is becoming more digitized. And then, of course, the impacts of irregular migration, and which some in the region are poorly positioned to manage. And all of these sort of challenges are happening in the context of an increasingly polarized region. So regional publics are frustrated by the weak governance and economic mismanagement. They're looking for candidates they think are capable of resolving entrenched problems. We talked a little bit about Milei earlier. But there's others in the region as well that are sort of non-traditional candidates. And that they are feeling this pressure from the publics to bring about quick solutions. That polarization can also have an impact on regional relationships and in fact, in strategic competition, right? So we see a government come in that's building a close relationship with PRC, swing to the other direction. Now they want to break the relationship with PRC. It may not be as easy as they think it is when they come to see the depth of the economic relationship. And in some cases, we've seen this polarization in the region contribute to, some tiffs, some internet tiffs, some Twitter tiffs, but a little bit of frictions, the interstate frictions that we see. And it's a region that has not experienced recently border disputes, but it can contribute to some of that threat perception among countries. So looking at these trends broadly, then the question is, well, what does this mean for how they're going to approach defense and security modernization? And so I'm just going to offer a few thoughts to get the conversation going. So one is that the governments really they have many goals, but truly they're very domestically focused. They're trying to answer the demands of their publics now. And this is going to impact the types of investments they're making on security and the balance between defense spending and public security spending, even though some of that defense spending obviously is for public security. Two, with few effective tools to address the seriousness of organized crime in the region, their limited resources, the short time horizons of the public. Many of the governments are going to continue to over-rely, I would say, on their militaries to address organized crime, including embracing mano dura or hard strategies, potentially risking civil and human rights violations. But really, the main point I want to make is that these are not, while these can be helpful, as we've seen in El Salvador, in bringing about a short-term reduction in violence, which is important for the public, they're not making the investments in the institution building that they need to do. And so when you end the state of exception, or you have to keep continuing the state of exception. I think another thing that is just worth thinking about, and this is not necessarily for defense modernization, but just the impact that this sort of cycle can have on support for democracy and the expectations of publics of what the solutions for security are going to be. And then the last thing I just wanted to say, I think here is that political polarization means that there can be not just shifts in the geopolitical relationships and geopolitical relationships on security, but even between administrations on how they're going to approach security. So it could be, there's been a period of underinvestment in defense. New government comes in and they think, oh, now we're going to invest. It can be hard to make those shifts. So you get kind of a desire to shift back and forth quite quickly, but a challenge with implementing those policies because some of these types of investments take place over many years. And then just one last thought I wanted to make at this point is we talked a little bit about the challenge of economic growth. And I think, for the governments in the region to make the types of to really bolster their economies in the direction they want to, one of the big challenges for nearshoring, in fact, has been the lack of infrastructure and has been the lack of sort of capacity around receiving the foreign direct investment that they're seeking. So I think beyond organized crime, and part of it is armoring the nearshoring, everything around that from the infiltration of organized crime. But I think one of the areas we're going to see new investments is in areas like cybersecurity, in providing safe passage to ports, things like that, that are going to hopefully position the region to be able to be more receptive, more attractive destination for foreign direct investment. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Marcelo, many tasks, not enough money.
Oh, I agree with that.
How is Chile addressing that issue in terms of taking forward its defense and security forces and modernizing?
Thank you, Peter. And I would say thank you to RUSI and Carlos for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm not going to that situation, the security situation in Latin America, because Sarah and Estefania tell us very good explanation of that. But what's happening in Chile is, despite we have the lowest rate of homicides, we became from 4.5 in 2018 to 6.3 homicides per 100,000, which is the 50% of increase in just 5 years. And we have now the presence of big criminal organizations like the Tren de Aragua or the Primer Comando Capital from Brazil, or even a Mexican cartel. So we are concerned. 9 out of 10 Chileans, the most important issue now is security, and it's not job, it's not the economy, it's about security. So security has had a big impact in our society. And what happened? Well, the society are demanding more on the armed forces. The issue is that you can't do more with less. Let me explain that. In the last few years, the core of the armed forces in Chile, it's defined by the Constitution. It's about the defense. They are not able, they can't intervene in internal issues, just in some exceptions. However, we have had forces from the army, mainly, deployed in the south of Chile for 3 years. So this is not an exception. This is long term. We also, if you see the elections from 2000 to 2024, and you take 5 years, you see that we have 2 to 3 elections every 5 years. Well, in the last 5 years, we have had 9 of them. And what's the issue? It's because the armed forces has to be in charge of the places where the elections take place. So it's more tasks. And the range of tasks that the society is demanding from the Chilean armed forces are wider. So you have now a wider range of tasks. You have more tasks. You have more extended in terms of time and geographical deployment. But at the same time, you have less money and less people. Well, from 2000 to 2022, the defense spending, the defense budget from Chile decreased from 2.7 to 1.8. But at the same time, the spending on personnel grew from 70% to almost 90%. So you have less money to operate. And in the same period of time, we decreased the number of conscripts. So we have a compulsory military service. We had more than 11,000 in 2016, but in 2022, we have just 3,000. So we are demanding more and more to the armed forces, but they don't have what they really need. I'm not saying that they are not doing their job. They're doing a very good job. The Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, they're doing their best. But it's very difficult to do the same or more if you have less. So what's the impact? Well, in short words, you have less time for training. You have less time for maintenance. You are using your systems more, so the useful life will be shortened. So you have to replace those equipment quickly. So it's difficult to modernize in that condition. So the armed forces started 25 to 30 years ago in a very good process to improve the educational system, and it's working very well. We changed our doctrine in order to operate in a NATO environment. So the Navy is doing that, the Air Force is doing that, the Army as well is doing that. So very good. But in terms of personnel, they are under a huge stress. And it's a difficult part. So a lot of tasks, not much to do it, and the armed forces are under a great stress. And it's not about this government. It's about several governments going back. So it's not now.
Thank you. Juan, I guess similar challenges, but a new administration with new ideas. What are the thoughts in Argentina about how to square the circle of more things to do, less money to do
Less
with?
money to do it. Well, Pete, thank you for inviting me, for hosting us. Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, RUSI, for being again here. It's for me an honor and a pleasure to share the panel with all these distinguished colleagues. First of all, when I hear my Chilean colleague, I'm hearing what was our past. And it is incredible because we share the same problems at that time. But luckily for us, we are trying to put some things in motion, looking their past, actually, which is important because in the near future we are going, hopefully, working together in issues related to defense and security. First of all, President Milei was quite clear on its priorities since day one. He established that the government needs to put our economy on the right track, doing the necessary reforms and unleash the economic power that Argentina has as a natural resource provider, for example, in critical minerals, food security, energy security. That strategic view gives us clear mission on what we should do on defense. But to be fair, after 4 years of this investment in the defense sector and keeping our armed forces at the operational minimum, we are at the crossroad right now. So Milei decided to change that and started a defense modernization using every single dollar in the smartest way possible, consider, and this is important for this new administration, that is taxpayer money. So somebody is paying for the defense, and it should be justified in the right way. So what we done this year, first of all, investing in acquiring new equipment, new capabilities as the F-16 from Denmark and the United States, and as important as the F-16, the P-3CN from Norway, but also with the assistance of the United States, and having newest partners. And if we look how we are trying to modernize, how to want to obtain resources for modernize our military, we are doing with our traditional partners, because 95% of our equipment come from the Western world, and 99% of our military training is with the South American region and the Western world. Again, it makes sense for us, it's economical sense to work with the United States, with European countries, which we were working in previous years. So the other guideline for us is modernization should be sustainable, and that is the other important issue. We know that we have not much resources, and we have to fulfill several of stacks. So modernization should be sustainable. What we are doing, we are giving away legacy systems at the noble but old A4, and we are prioritizing specific programs like the modernization of our combat aircraft fleet, the modernization of our helicopter fleets, better radars and monitoring capabilities. And my minister, Mr. Petri, stressed the importance of acquiring mile and hail drones and working with the security ministry in order to improve our surveillance capacities and border control, which is an important thing for us, especially in the northern part of the country. And we're looking forward to work in those areas with Chile and Peru also. And the last comment on this issue is that we stopped to funding some programs because the previous administration was a mix between mismanagement and corruption. So corruption is a real problem in the defense sector in Latin America, in each sector of Latin America, but in defense was completely badly for the defense capacities in the case of Argentina. And what have been done in that sense? Well, we stopped funding those programs. For example, some shipyard construction that never were delivered in time to our armed forces, and started to put that money on training and capability, as I already mentioned. So this is important for us because we are not taking more money for our budget, but we are trying to reallocate funds in order to gain more consistent delivery capacities on that issue. What we want, or what my minister and the president want, if we are able to put our economy on their own feet, maybe to move the defense budget from the 0.6%, 0.8% to a humble 1.2-1.5% of the GDP. But the good news is, if we increase in those numbers and we remove mismanagement and corruption, probably we are going to be able to deliver what our society needs. That's.
Thank you.
For a second?
Please.
I just wanted to, and then he'd actually asked me to do this, and I didn't do it. So, but the points that you made, I think, were just so excellent, and I think it's worth looking at these countries in South America sort of in the context of the region, because one of the things that comes through really clear is it's really you're dealing with two regions when you're looking at defense modernization in Latin America. You have some countries that really have the bandwidth to make these investments, and really the part of their strategic imperative is to have a naval presence, whatever that looks like. And then you have other countries that are truly more dependent on the assistance they receive from other countries, and that is oftentimes guiding their decisions. But I just wanted to go back and say, in this sort of era of belt tightening that I talked about, countries are, and even these countries that are facing really serious public security battles like Mexico, they're having to make really difficult choices. So just for context, defense spending in the region has remained for the last decade or so around 1.1 to 1.3% of GDP. But it varies a lot, right? From less than 1% in Argentina, in Mexico, to closer to 3% of GDP in Colombia. So you see a wide range, and not necessarily related to the resources or the imperative that countries put on it. So it's a lot of interesting differentiation there. Spending on security can be harder to define because that can include just the way countries consider it. Could be just police forces, civilian forces, but it could also be broader, including other anti-crime spending. But in general, the IMF estimates that the region spends about 2%. So actually twice as much, 2% of GDP on security. And that's not surprising, of course, given the threat of the insecurity that the region faces in terms of insecurity. So what does this mean in terms of the types of efforts that governments are actually going to make? I mean, I think the point is they're going to have to make choices. And so what we're expecting to see is that really the governments are going to give priority to modernization efforts that meet their immediate priorities, namely spending on systems related to public security. These aren't only civilian expenditures, and oftentimes there's an overlap between a military role and a public security role. But we're likely to see them continue to invest in armored vehicles, drones, especially for border security and also counter-narcotics, surveillance systems, and then infrastructure we mentioned, especially as governments are really trying to see a lot of energy around building port capacity, but other types of infrastructure, and so the requirements for that. But also when you look across the region, a lot of the militaries and really civilian services are still struggling to provide the maintenance and sustainment of the platforms they have. So that will, I think, continue to be an area of investment, and that's from naval vessels to helicopters. And they're probably going to be focused on those investments in land, air, and sea vehicles. And then in some cases, in the countries, in particular Colombia, but other countries, for the NATO interoperability. But those are going to be very discrete investments, given the whole range of other things they need to focus on. In terms of what that means for the cost of security for the region, in general, the sense is that relying on the military to provide public security is expensive, right? Because militaries are expensive, especially when you start getting into more specialized roles and operations. But as civilian services, the police forces have become more militarized in the type of equipment that they're using. It maybe is a wash. And then another thing to just think about is that, I mean, I think, systems like drones are cheaper than maybe some of the more traditional military systems. But a lot of the new technology, especially around cyber security, does rely on artificial intelligence. And so that is expensive, and also a question on whether the countries have the power capacity to support some of those investments. And then the last thing I'll just say, because I guess for the pro side of the importance of making these investments is just that as countries are able to successfully address insecurity, it does improve actually their spending capability. So the IDB recently issued a new report saying that insecurity in the region costs countries about 3.5% of GDP. So that's almost the same amount we were talking about in terms of spending on public security and defense combined. So really there is, in terms of the sort of regaining in human capital, the savings for the private sector and what they have to invest on security, and just the relief for public spending. There's significant gains to be had for countries if they can make these investments successfully.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was...
No, not at all. Thank you. So I was going to ask my next question about global power competition and some of the implications, but I think maybe because I want to give time for questions from the audience, we might circle back to that at the end, or maybe somebody can ask a question about it and we can explore it that way. What I want to do instead is sort of broaden the lens, because I think that a lot of the conversation today has been about Latin America and the Caribbean as a continent whose main geographic relationship is to the north. But of course, it's a continent that's surrounded by really important shared spaces. 2 great oceans, Antarctic, space, cyberspace. all of which are growing importance in terms of their defense security implications, whether that be around resource access or sort of digital infrastructure and many of or dual use purpose. So I'm wondering if how those factors are sort of playing into the reforms that are going on in the region. Maybe Juan, you want to start? You know, is that part of the thinking that's going on in Argentina?
Yes, of course, we are preparing our new directive of defense policy for this March. And thanks for reframing and not only putting great power competition, but also talking about the global power competition, because we have a strategic competitor, which is the United Kingdom in the South Atlantic, and this is important for all of us to know. So about the global power competition, let me start by saying that the region, and yesterday was saying, and it is true right now, that it's an open battlefield for this competition among great power. The US, even if the US remain as a key player in the Western Hemisphere, Russia, and it's quite different from the Cold War, has three main allies right now, and all of them have the capacity to put pressure under the Panama Canal. So Donald Trump should be taken seriously because he knows that Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba working together have the ability to derail the ship traffic over the Panama Canal. And also, China and Russia are competing and are quite present in the Arctic region. That's why it's this new idea of that Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom should be more active in order to attack those issues. And directly impacts in how we look into this situation in South America and in the region. Also, it is important to know that China is a quite different player than Russia. It's more prudent, it's more wise. They are playing a long game. Also, if they are revisionists, they are smarter, I think, that the Russian. And China is working with all Latin American countries in order to put their economic capacity in our natural resources and using it as their capacity to weaponize interdependence, which Argentina, Chile, and other countries in Latin America has a role in this new era of weaponization of interdependence. Also, Iran is quite active in Venezuela and Bolivia. They are spreading political turmoil, and they are trying to put pressures in all the countries on the region, especially in the border countries, and that is a common concern again from Peru, Chile, and Argentina, and of course Paraguay. And if we look the future choke points, if something happens in the Suez Canal or in the Malacca Strait, of course, the Arctic region, the Panama Canal, and the Magallanes Strait is going to play a huge role in having the globalization flowing. And the good news is the two nations, Chile, of course, and Argentina, we want to work together in order to secure the safe passage of the globalization. And it is important for me to tell to you that about the Malvinas Islands, the biggest change that we can consider is that we agree to disagree with the United Kingdom. But the important issue is that we are trying to move into the future, knowing that the territorial integrity is part of the same principles that both defense as a part of the same international community. So, and there is a good case, because in the case of Ukraine, Argentina and the United Kingdom are in the same side defending territorial integrity, which is one of our main claims on the issue of Malvinas. And the good news is that we wanted to do it bilaterally and under the auspices of international law. And another important thing for us is that we were following the Colombia example, and we wanted to join to NATO global partnership, because that kind of association fulfill several of our defense interests in Argentina. With Francisco de Santibáñez in 2019, we wrote a paper to a competitor think tank, which was the IISS, and we talk about this, and we started to develop an ideas on how we better involve and better communication with Europeans. NATO is the main gateway to do that, because as my colleague previously told, it's going to enhance our interoperability. It's going to enhance and modernize our military doctrine, improve our operational standards, and at the same time, it's going to allow us to contribute to the rule-based international order, which is one of the President Milei mandates, because he believes in liberal order. We want to contribute to that. And not only we move to NATO global partnership, but also with other Latin American countries like Brazil, Ecuador, and Colombia. We joined to the Combined Maritime Forces since this year. And the reason is quite obvious, because the importance of globalization and the importance of the sea-like communication. And if we are going to have a policy on choke points, we want to know what is going on in other important choke points. So my final question about that is about the great power competition. Argentina is quite clear. The previous administration preferred to handle some kind of ambiguity and to move and dance between China and United States and doing crazy things. For us, it's not convenience. We can do good economic relation with China, but in the security realm, we are in the Western Hemisphere. We have a quite important strategic position. Geography mandates over politics, as Mackinder always remember, and Robert Kaplan. And we are responsible in the Antarctica with Chile and with the United Kingdom, because all of us have territorial claims there. And we have to be prudent, but we have to work with the Western world.
Thank you. Marcelo, a question then combining global power competition, but also the shared spaces. I couldn't sit here as a naval officer and not, of course, mention the deep relationships through Cochrane and other such things that sort of exist between Chile and European partners, US partners in terms of equipment purchase and sort of doctrine, and balancing that with some of those wider economic imperatives and relationships, but also some of the risks that this new interest from more powers has brought into the region. I recall very well when we visited on the Global Strategic Trends program and talked with you in Chile about some of the concerns about what's happening in the shared spaces around illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, for example, as a growing concern, but also infrastructure in the shared spaces, so things like subsea cables, which are growing exponentially in your region, but of course that brings risk. That's something that's been brought home to us very recently in the Euro-Atlantic zone. It's happening in Indo-Pacific around Taiwan. There seems to be a new Chinese startup called cutyourcables.com that's going around doing that, that sort of business. So is that something that's driving your thinking in terms of security sector reform and modernization of defense in Chile as well?
Well, it's a great question. It's a long question as well. Despite we know that China is the most important commercial partner for most of the Latin American countries. For Chile, it's more than 40% of our exports goes to China. More than 60% of our exports go to Asia as a general. However, we are more like-minded with countries in Europe or in North America. So we have cultural ties. Many people in Chile comes from Italy, Germany, Spain, and so forth. So we have close ties, and And you see that the commercial ties with China has not been trespassed to cultural ties. So you don't find people who want to have experience in China. You have young people trying to have working holidays in Europe or so forth. And in the military sphere, we keep our approach to the Western countries, to the U.S. So we have a NATO doctrine. So we are able to operate with the U.S. Navy in many exercises in the Pacific. We have the Air Force operating with the U.S. Air Force. We have the Chilean Army operating with the British Army, the Spanish Army, and so forth. So the most part of the military equipment in the region doesn't come from China. They came from the U.S., they came from Europe, from Israel, even from Brazil. And secondly, you have South Korea and Russia as well. So we don't see military alliance with China, but we see some kind of new relationship with other countries out of the region, like mainly Russia and even with Iran. So in the last 20 years, we saw that in 2008, I think, or 2009, 2 strategic bombers from Russia visited Cuba, and it happens twice. And you have Russian vessels visiting the Caribbean waters and ports in Venezuela, even nuclear submarines. But this activities has been very, very interesting because they started in 2008 when Russia has an intervention in Georgia. They have another new push in 2013 and 2014 when Russia illegally had an annexation of Crimea. So it has a combination. For Chilean perspective, the most important is what Iran is doing. Why? Well, Iran has doubled their diplomatic position. So they had 5 embassies in Latin America, but after the 2010, they had 11. They have been trying to organize Islamic center of culture, something like that, in many countries, including Chile. And they have presence in Cuba. They have important presence in Venezuela. But what is not concerning for us is they have an important presence in Chile, in Bolivia. And Bolivia has a 850 kilometers border with us. And we have problems controlling that border. And the real problem with that for us is we don't really know what they are doing. They have a new defense and security agreement between Iran and Bolivia. We have some information about drones, about military assistance, collaboration in terms of logistics, and so forth. But we don't know the details. And it's a big concern. Argentina has the same problem. There is information about some Iranian citizens running or walking in Argentinian street with credentials from Bolivia. So it's a huge question for us. What are they doing, and how can this affect us, our solution, our security situations? And at the end of the day, in the region, we are not a priority for the United States. We haven't been. We are not, and I don't think we will be a priority. And it's not a problem. It's not a real problem, because the security problems of Latin America must be solved by Latin American countries, no one else. And if we want to find a solution, and I agree with Juan, we have to do it in the bilateral or trilateral way, not as a bunch of countries, because we have different problems and different approach. And depending on the political view we will change institution and so forth. So bilateral or trilateral agreement like we are been doing with Argentina and Chile for a long time. We have a joint and combined force. It's like a brigade side units combined and joint, and we have been working at that for many years. So this is one of a good approaches that we can share with you.
And I guess broadening the lens on these questions, both of great power competition growing in the region, but also in the really critical shared spaces around the region. How's that looking from the US?
Yeah, so I agree completely with comments that the other panelists made. I wanted to just say, sort of from a broader perspective, we think a lot about what this, what we call strategic competition, means for, and I use the term global south, right? But I mean, I think, just even using that term when you're talking about Latin America, not every country, and in fact, most countries probably wouldn't put their hand up and say, yes, I'm a part of the global south. I mean, probably Brazil would, right? So, and other countries. But when you're looking at the Latin America and Caribbean region, really the countries, and kind of going back to the pressing demands that they're facing, the countries in the region, I think, don't see themselves as having to make a choice between the US and China, right? Different international partners can help them on different pressing needs. So it might be on security here, it might be on trade there, it might be on something else, investments in education or social welfare programs. So I think countries in the region are really looking to have a range of partnerships. Beyond the great powers, they're also looking at Europe, they're looking at the UK, they're looking at Israel and other countries to have as partners. So I think, from the US perspective, we understand that, and I think that doesn't mean that we don't also look with concern at some of the trends that you're talking about. In particular, I think just because of the advances that China has made in the region, we are concerned that the influence that strong economic relationship, and sometimes security, but more it's the economic relationship, the influence that can have on governments. Of course, worry about the investments that both state-owned enterprises, but also just Chinese companies are making in sensitive areas of technology, and how that will become sort of more enmeshed in the technological advancements in those areas. And then I think something that we talked about earlier, just the role that some of these external countries can have in helping facilitate or continuing to drive the strength of transnational organized crime, serious and organized crime in the region. So, we have those concerns. I think they're shared. I think in general, though, the sort of founding principles of foreign policy in the region are going to stand, which are non-intervention, sovereignty, and devising their own solutions. So I think, from the U.S. perspective, we see that as a balance, and countries in the region are probably differently able to find that balance between building the relationship and then also protecting their interests and equities. So then what does that mean for shared spaces? And I mean, I think especially when you're talking about space, we're talking about, some of the, climate issues. These are inherently transnational, right? Like they demand multilateral solutions. And I think it's a challenge because in the region, there's a lot of factors that have impeded integration and finding multilateral solutions. And some of that is, the polarization in the region, but even going further back, geographic barriers. I mean, we see that in other parts of the world, right? But you've got deserts, you've got mountains, you've got all sorts of things that just make it hard to even have the infrastructure to unite the region, to integrate their economies, and those are the things that sort of drive towards collaboration. So I think it'll be interesting to see in Antarctica as it becomes more accessible, and this is sort of a dynamic that we've seen in the Arctic, as we were talking about But as it becomes more accessible and countries need to sort of come together to figure out how to continue to do research and also provide safe security in that area, I think it will be a forcing mechanism for more integration. But I think the other thing that is interesting is, and in fact I would say that because of the fiscal constraints that we've talked about, there's an economies of scale that come from being able to work together to complement each other. But the other thing that I think will be interesting, especially in terms of technological innovation in some of these areas, is the role that the private sector is playing in public-private partnerships. So that's where we're seeing some, interesting, really sort of technological transfer to the region. And I think, again, that will be something to watch in terms of how governments are able to, or governments or local businesses, even the local private sectors are able to maintain control and maintain sort of the leading role in the investments and in the new technologies that are happening there. So I think in general, it will be, I'm an optimist, so I think it will be a drive towards greater integration, greater collaboration. And I think that also maybe helps the region provide a united front as the global arena looks in to see how they fit into this equation. So just some initial thoughts on that.
Thank you. And just to finish off this sort of part of the conversation before we open to questions, Estefania, bringing it back to where we started with serious and organised crime, and I picked up and I scribbled some notes as you were saying some things, which seemed to me related to quite a lot of the other issues we've covered. Control of access to ports, exploring those sort of vulnerabilities within societies, which are also then affecting willingness to invest in defence sectors and other parts of the security architecture. Do you see these developments creating new opportunities for transnational crime, for the cartels, or new dilemmas for them?
Yeah, well, adding into the equation the challenges of climate change as well, I think that it has and it will continue to have a big impact on the aggravation of the structural drivers of violence and poverty, which are the breeding ground for serious and organized crime to, again, recruit all types of people, right? So how low or how challenged the state capacity to guarantee the basics for civilians to thrive, the more challenged it will get by pressures of organized crime, by climate change, I think the most affected will be the poorer and the more remote communities where they only have a handful of options to thrive. So serious and organized crime will become a challenge even more difficult to address. And the worse it gets with climate change, the harder it will be for states to keep up.
Thank you. We've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully that's prompted a lot of questions. So what I'd like to do now is open us out for questions. We've got the microphones ready to go. I think we've got...
Thank you for your presentation. Basically, there was something that was missing. I wanted to find out what the US is doing in terms of looking at China's investment in space program and hypersonic missile in Latin America. Is it going to tilt the geopolitical balance and the balance of power between Taiwan and Latin America in the foreseeable future? What you didn't mention that in your presentation, so I wanted to find out what the US is doing in terms of the Chinese space program, the lunar program in Latin America, and its development of hypersonic missiles. Is the US trying to look into it to ensure that it doesn't create a situation where it will tilt the balance of power in terms of leveraging Chinese interest in Taiwan as against US interest in Latin America?
Yeah, so I'm gonna start by saying, as an analyst, as an intelligence analyst, I don't really, not a policymaker, so I can't really speak to the specifics of U.S. policy.
That's the Jack Ryan answer.
It's the Jack Ryan answer. I'm sorry, I can't comment on that. But I mean, I will say yes. This is when thinking about where PRC investments and partnerships are in the region. Space is probably one of the bigger concerns. I think it also falls into that challenge of immediate versus strategic, right? So yes, paying attention and concerned, but I can't really speak to what actions the U.S. is taking.
But if I could do a bit of advertising.
But you can.
Well, I'll do a bit of advertising from the work done by my old team. If you look up global street trends, some of that is covered in there. Edition 7 that came out in September. We had a question in the back there.
Thank you. My name is Vinicius Carvalho from King's College London. Good to see some of old friends here. For you both specifically, there is one aspect on defense and security in Latin America that is quite relevant and we didn't touch upon, and I would like to hear from both countries, is the perspective of the role of armed forces in development. In about 9 countries in Latin America, it's constitutional or infra-constitutional description of role of armed forces to work with national development. And that means sometimes infrastructure constructions and supporting humanitarian assistance as well, or disaster relief. That drives quite a lot of energy, efforts, and resources. And that seems to be something that the local population appreciate a lot, and local governments, independent of being left, right, or whatever, or center or high, they appreciate a lot as well. So how is the dilemma that we can, or how to face this dilemma of making a professional military apparatus detached from this internal safety role or assistance role or development role in countries in which the building of the identity of the armed forces were through this process as well. So I dumped that for you. Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question, and Chile has a lot of experience doing that. And I think the Chilean armed forces are doing very well doing that. On one hand, you have the capacities of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force collaborating with the society. So you have the military corps of engineers who are building roads in places that nobody else wants to do it. And they do a very good job in Tierra del Fuego, for example, very south, in the high plateau. You have the Navy who is able to connect the small islands and support the communities in those places. You have the Air Force with important tasks for supporting what is happening in the Israel Island and so forth. We support, the armed forces support the scientific research, and at the same time, we have a good policy. We have a defense policy who takes care about that issue. So we have a well-organized system of natural disaster reaction. We have a lot of natural disasters in Chile. So we have earthquake, we have floods, we have fires in the last few years about the climate change. So I think we have a good organization and a good communication and collaboration between the civil society and the armed forces. And the armed forces are very well appreciated about that. So the armed forces are between or among the best considered institutions among the Chilean society, and mainly is because of what you described. And at the same time, the armed forces are pushing the industry. And let me put you an example. The shipbuilding capacity. The Navy has been pushing that for decades. And we have now a new icebreaker, a brand new icebreaker built just in Chile. It's a high capacity, it's a new one, and they are pushing further. But it's not just the military industry. It's related with the local organizations and other industry that collaborate in this very good environment. So we have been doing a lot. We have a good example. I can provide more information if anybody wants to go deeper, and it's a good example. Thank you for your question.
Just because I completely agree with what you said, and in Argentina is quite the similar situation. The idea of in Argentina there are some discussion on how compatible is the secondary mission of the armed forces in order to the primary mission of the armed forces, which is engage in war. And if you are not allowing men to be professionals on the primary mission. So the discussion is nonsense at some point, because you have to look at the continuum. For example, you have this idea of the 3-block corporal, the corporal that in one block fights, in the other block do peacekeeping mission, and another block do policing task mission. And the United States, United Kingdom, and Europe did it quite well in the Balkans and other places around the world. So there is no debate there. So because we want to work on the contingent, and we need to know which we are going to prioritize. Very early in the Petri's tasks to assume as a defense minister, we faced a situation in the Patagonia, which was the severe climate effect with the snow and putting a lot of production, small production there in the Patagonia under risk. And the only thing that we have in that location was a bunch of M113, and the military ready to mobilize and to develop humanitarian aid, develop food and that kind of thing. And the military was amazing, because they follow order quickly. They do not ask which was the order. Just give me the order, give me the plans, and I'm going to mobilize on that. And actually, they at the end of the day, they sustain and they contribute that nothing bad really happens, and that was highly appreciated. The different issue, and that's a thing that we must learn from Chile, that unfortunately the left use the military and development to do business. So getting money and put it into their pockets. And I'm going to give you an example. How long it took to us to build, it took to the previous administration to build a ship, a patrol boat ship, which is a training boat. 7 years. Usually, a shipyard, a competitive shipyard, took to 6 months to 1 year to build it. So what happened with the rest of the money? And this is important to say, because the left usually use the military as a force of development, and use the United States as an example, no? And say, well, the United States government puts a lot of money in private sector and sometimes spend a little bit more in order to develop the society. But in Latin America, the corruption issue is a problem. I think it's everywhere. But unfortunately for us, in the past 20 years, especially during the Kirchner administration, it was a missed opportunity, because we never create a value chain in our defense community. For example, we still have drones which are prototypes, but never develop a production sire type of drone, and we are quite capable. There are 2 exceptions: INVAP, which is quite good in producing serial things, but unfortunately, it wasn't the case. If we can control or eradicate, the best way is eradicate corruption, maybe the defense industry in Argentina has a chance to give muscle to our economic transformation.
Thank you. So we've got a question over here, and then we've got one here.
Thank you all. Mike Asensio, Florida International University. As you all are talking about modernizing these areas, I've got a question on, and I didn't hear a whole lot on cyber policy, right? Modernizing that, cyber warfare, looking at issues, because there's no geography that controls cyber, right? Policies, right? That's why I want to hear from you. Policies and definitions, we're seeing now cartels being designated as terrorist organizations. At what point do ransomware groups and these very large outfits, where do we draw the line whether it's warfare or not, right? And I would love to listen to what unified approach there could potentially be amongst us in the region. Thank you.
So why don't we take the question here as well, and then we'll sort of take them both together. If we've got a microphone over here, please, thanks.
Thank you. Giselle Gamble, Chief of Staff, Henry Jackson Society, based in London. So my question is for our two analysts here. It's kind of a means to an end question, where the means are development of infrastructure versus defense spending, and the end is reducing domestic organized crime. So from my experience, what I've seen, especially in the Caribbean, is actually that desperation is what leads to crime, and desperation is often caused by a lack of infrastructure. So my question really is, as analysts, are there any markers that you can identify or look for to try and dictate whether, which means is more effective to try and get to reducing, the domestic crime? Yeah.
Thank you. So I think we'll take them, the cyber question for you two first, and then the sort of means and ends question for you two.
As a domain, you know that the battlefield is not geography, and we are trying to work into that and modernize our capacity. Every single country in Latin America has a cyber command, but the capacities on working on that cyber command and to prevent or to engage in an offensive operation is quite lower. Yeah, I'm not going to say zero because nobody knows, but maybe we are just a little bit better working in defensive operation, which is clear. We face that threat every year, but at the same time, it's crazy because in Latin America, the narrative is the 19th-20th century sovereignty discussion. And at that point, it is quite difficult for us, it's quite difficult for the state bureaucrats, it's quite difficult for people who want to modernize this to work with, for example, people at the opposition party that the only thing that they only know is this is a sovereignty. If you are going to work with the United States, for example, they accuse you to giving them the key, the whole access to our critical infrastructure, and that's it. And my answer to them is, look, if we are really honest, everyone can access to our infrastructure if they really want, if they have offensive capacities. And I'm going to give you the same example that I did when I was invited in 2022. The largest disinformation or information operation done against us between 2009 and 2012, it was led by the United Kingdom, called Operation Quito, and we already know that because of the Snowden leaks. And it's fine because, no, it's not fine, but it's not fine at all, but it's fine in this way. It is fine because at some point when you talk about cyber, it's also which network are you engaging. And in that sense, we have to look better, and it demands us a real conversation on what we wanted to do, not only first as a country, but then as a region in this domain. And one last thing, the good things is in 2024 in Mendoza, it was the Minister of Defense Conference of the Americas, and we agreed to start to work together to have a conversation between our countries at the hemispheric level in issues related to artificial intelligence and how to develop an idea of how militarized we want this type of technology in our arsenals, and that is good because it's going to need to improve our discussion and our understanding on that sense. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to be very short on that. We finally understood that the cyber side is very important. Finally, so we are a little bit late on that. In Chile, we finally have a policy, a cyber policy, so we are working on that. I think in the region, just probably Brazil is the only that has some capabilities of offensive operations, but the rest we concentrated in defense ourselves. And in that case, the civil sector are the ones that pushed that. So the bank, the financial sector, they have been in this discussion for a long time. So let me finish with that. I will take some words from John Griffith, who is the head of AthenaLab studies, and he said, for transnational threats, we need a multinational approach. And in this particular case, this is the issue. So we need an approach. Probably we have to start with bilateral work that works, and then we can spread it to other countries.
Thank you. And then just to finish on the question of ends and means and ways.
Ends and means, yeah. So I'm going to, I think that it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but you're sort of posing the question is, should governments invest in security first or they should invest in infrastructure first? And I think the way I'm thinking about it, if this is helpful, is really infrastructure is security, right? If you're building a port, you don't build a port and say like, well, we're not going to put any protections in place. We're just going to we'll figure that out later. So when you're talking about digital inclusion, when you're talking about, access to banking, any of those things, I mean, I think security needs to be part of it to put in place now the protections that they need to make them less vulnerable. So I guess that's a cop-out answer because it doesn't get to the question of, but how many boots on the ground do I need to handle this problem? The other thing, which a little bit goes back to the question about cyber capabilities, is about the social humanitarian assistance role of the militaries is, I do think, there's an increasing demand on security services, both the military and civilian services, to be much more technically capable, right? And I, say this this is around the world, and so I do think there is a tension, a demand to have our security services have more capabilities in that area that might actually ultimately, I'm not sure if it complements or if it's in conflict with that role. But again, when you get to things like disaster response, so much of that now is about domain awareness and things that really demand that technical capability. So anyway, sorry, that was just amusing. But yeah, I think they're going to have to make choices, but I don't think it's necessarily an either or. I think sometimes the security is the infrastructure or vice versa. Right.
As you say, creating more shipping and stuff like that.
Right.
I wonder how much that makes a difference.
Right. Is it street lighting or is it, yeah.
I think it also depends on how you define the threat faced by the state. If you frame it as the threat being the violence that is inflicted on the civilian population, then your response will be completely different because, yes, absolutely, it's necessary to on a structural matter to resolve the inequalities that the lack of basic infrastructure is kind of pushing many people into the illicit activities because they need to survive in the most remote areas. Like if you have the cultivators of coca in Colombia, they need to survive, and cultivating coca is one of the ways that they actually do that. But when we're looking at it from the violence perspective, is it like governments then need to pay attention into where you're investing your money? Because also government responses can increase violence, and that happened during Merida Initiative when Mexico decided to deploy the military to the streets and move all the resources into giving like a hard fist against criminal organizations, and that brought violence out of control. And since then, the violence has been out of control. So it depends on how you frame it, really.
Thank you. So I'm going to attempt to, I'm afraid we're out of time, but there's lunch coming up. So I'm going to attempt to summarize very quickly. So more tasks, more challenges, whether that be through the rise of serious organized crime, the wide implications of global power competition on the continent, the demands of accessing the resources and other benefits of the shared spaces that surround the continent, or the impacts of climate change, as well as the access to critical minerals that we're all going to need to fix those problems. No money, more money to deal with those issues, in fact, in some cases less, and the region varies in terms, by country and by area, in terms of how it's addressing those many challenges. So it's been a rich conversation, and there is going to be an opportunity over lunch, which I think is back on the top floor, to continue having these discussions with the panel, should you wish, but would you please join me in thanking them for